George Knapp has revealed more major UFO stories than most journalists ever touch, and he's done it the hard way. Interviews, documents, verification, and years of follow-up. But there's another side to why people trust him. Because for decades, the weirdest material, videos, reports, testimony, doesn't go straight to the internet. It goes to someone like Knapp first. A journalist with a reputation for not burning sources, not rushing unverified claims, and not publishing something just because it would go viral. That creates a quiet tension at the center of his career. He does reveal, but sometimes he can't. Sometimes he won't. To protect a person, to confirm a detail, or because the consequences are bigger than the headline. This is the story of what Knapp has brought to light, and what still never makes it out. Chapter 1. The Journalist Before the Phenomenon. Before UFOs, before Area 51, before Skinwalker Ranch, George Knapp was already a seasoned investigative journalist. His early career wasn't built on mystery or speculation. It was built on routine, difficult reporting, crime, corruption, political pressure, institutional failure. Stories where facts mattered, sources carried real risk, and mistakes had consequences. This background is essential to understanding why Knapp approaches the UFO subject differently from almost anyone else. Investigative journalism trains a certain instinct. You learn quickly that dramatic claims are common, but verifiable ones are rare. You learn that people lie for attention, money, protection, or ideology. And you learn that the most dangerous stories are often the quiet ones, the ones people are hesitant to tell. When unusual aerospace and UFO-related information began crossing Knapp's path, he didn't treat it as a mystery to solve or a belief system to defend. He treated it as a reporting problem. Who is speaking? Why now? What do they stand to gain, and what do they stand to lose? Very early on, Knapp noticed something that didn't align with typical hoaxes. Many of the people contacting him didn't want publicity. They asked for anonymity. Some refused interviews altogether and only provided documents or off-the-record context. Others spoke once, cautiously, and never followed up. From a distance, that looks suspicious. From inside journalism, it looks familiar. Because fear changes behavior. And fear often indicates pressure that has nothing to do with fantasy or attention. Knapp understood that publishing recklessly would destroy access. Burn a source once and the phone stops ringing. Push a story before it's ready and trust evaporates. Not just with one person, but with an entire network. So he slowed down. He verified what could be verified. He acknowledged uncertainty where it existed. And when information couldn't be responsibly published because of source safety, legal exposure, or unresolved verification, he didn't force it into the public sphere. This restraint frustrated some audiences. Critics accused him of holding back. Others wanted stronger conclusions, clearer declarations, definitive answers. But Knapp was operating under a rule most sensational coverage ignores. Credibility is finite. Once lost, it never fully returns. In a subject already burdened by exaggeration, hoaxes, and ideological extremes, Knapp chose to protect the only currency that mattered: trust. Trust from sources, trust from viewers, trust from institutions that didn't want to be misrepresented. By the time UFOs entered mainstream discussion decades later, Knapp wasn't adapting to a trend. He had already spent years working inside the tension between public interest and responsible disclosure. That tension didn't make him famous overnight, but it positioned him to become something far more influential. A journalist trusted not just to publish extraordinary claims, but to know when not to. And that judgment would soon place him at the center of one of the most controversial stories in modern UFO history. Chapter 2. The Bob Lazar Threshold. Every journalist has a moment where a story stops being theoretical and becomes personal. For George Knapp, that moment arrived in 1989. When Bob Lazar entered Knapp's life, He didn't arrive with spectacle. He arrived with caution. Lazar initially concealed his identity using shadows and altered names, not to create mystery, but to protect himself from immediate consequences. That alone set him apart from the usual parade of UFO claimants. Knapp didn't treat Lazar as a revelation. He treated him as a risk. The claims were extraordinary. Employment at a facility south of Groom Lake, work on non-human technology, propulsion systems that didn't behave according to known physics. Any one of these statements, taken alone, would normally end a conversation. But journalism isn't about dismissing claims, it's about testing them. Knapp began doing what he always did. He checked Lazar's statements against known geography, timelines, and internal consistency. He confirmed details Lazar never presented as proof, but as context. Locations, schedules, security routines, physical layouts. Some elements aligned in ways that were difficult to explain as coincidence. At the same time, large portions of Lazar's background appeared to be missing. Academic records were incomplete. Employment histories were disputed. Critics seized on those gaps immediately, treating them as proof of deception. Knapp didn't. Instead, he asked a different question. Why would records vanish selectively? Not everything, not cleanly, but enough to create doubt. That ambiguity placed Knapp in an impossible position. Publishing the story would permanently attach his credibility to a man whose claims could never be fully verified. Not publishing it would mean suppressing testimony that, at the very least, deserved public scrutiny. Knapp chose a third path. When the story aired, it was framed carefully, not as confirmed truth, not as debunked fantasy, but as the testimony of a man whose claims were internally consistent, partially corroborated, and impossible to fully resolve using civilian tools. That distinction is critical. Knapp never declared Lazar proven. He never asked the audience to believe. He asked them to pay attention. The backlash was immediate and long-lasting. Critics accused Knapp of legitimizing fiction. Supporters accused him of not going far enough. Over time, the Lazar story became a fault line in UFO discourse, not because of what it proved, but because it refused to collapse. Decades later, the core elements of Lazar's account remain unchanged. No dramatic reversals, no confessions, no definitive exposure. Just a story that exists in permanent suspension, contested, unresolved, and stubbornly persistent. For Knapp, Lazar wasn't just a source, he was a warning. From that moment on, Knapp understood the cost of crossing certain lines. Publishing sensitive material could permanently alter careers, reputations, and lives, including his own. But refusing to publish could be just as consequential. The Lazar episode didn't turn Knapp into a believer, it turned him into a gatekeeper. Someone who now understood that in the UFO world, truth doesn't arrive cleanly, and once released, it can never be retrieved. And after Lazar, the messages didn't slow down. They multiplied. Chapter 3. The Flow of Unseen Information. After the Bob Lazar story aired, something subtle but permanent changed. George Knapp didn't just become known to the public, he became known to a very specific audience. People who had information but nowhere safe to take it. The messages didn't arrive all at once. At first they came sporadically. A former serviceman with a story he'd never told publicly. A technician with a fragment of data that didn't make sense in isolation. A witness who only wanted to know if anyone else had seen what they saw. Over time, that trickle became a steady flow. What's important is not the volume of material Knapp received, but the pattern of it. Many of these individuals shared one thing in common. They were not looking for exposure. They weren't chasing attention, money, or belief. In many cases, they were actively afraid of being identified. Some requested anonymity immediately. Others insisted on meeting off-record, sometimes only once, sometimes never again. A few provided materials without context and disappeared entirely from contact. This is the part of the UFO story the public rarely sees. Because journalism doesn't reward restraint, it rewards publication. Knapp was now operating in a space where publishing everything was not only irresponsible, it was dangerous. Revealing certain details could expose military procedures. It could identify individuals indirectly. It could compromise systems that had nothing to do with UFOs, but everything to do with national defense. So Knapp made decisions most audiences never notice. He withheld names. He delayed stories for years. He declined to air material that couldn't be verified without harming someone else. To outsiders, this looked like secrecy. To journalists, it looked like triage. Not every story is ready for air. Not every truth survives exposure. Knapp has been clear over the years. Some material never reaches the public because releasing it would create more damage than clarity. That doesn't mean the information is false. It means it exists in a category journalism struggles with. Information that may be real, but cannot be responsibly published. This placed Knapp in a unique and uncomfortable role. He wasn't just reporting on UFOs anymore. He was managing risk. Risk to sources, risk to credibility, risk to the integrity of journalism itself. And the longer this went on, the clearer something became. The UFO subject wasn't chaotic because it lacked evidence. It was chaotic because evidence arrived fragmented, incomplete, and constrained by systems designed to limit disclosure. Knapp wasn't hiding answers. He was watching them arrive in pieces that never fully connected. That fragmentation had a cost. Carrying unresolved information for years changes how you see stories, institutions, and even silence. It creates a kind of professional pressure most journalists never experience, knowing that what you don't publish may matter just as much as what you do. By this point in his career, Knapp had become something rare, a trusted intake point. A journalist people contacted not because he promised exposure, but because he understood restraint. And that reputation would soon draw him toward a place where restraint itself would be tested. A location where documentation piled up, but explanations never stabilized. A place called Skinwalker Ranch. Chapter 4. Skinwalker Ranch, when data refuses to behave. When George Knapp first became involved with Skinwalker Ranch, it wasn't because of folklore. It was because of reports. Not rumors passed through communities, but documented incidents. Strange aerial sightings, unexplained animal injuries, equipment failures, and repeated accounts from individuals who had no interest in publicity. What drew Knapp's attention wasn't any single event. It was persistence. The same location, the same kinds of anomalies, over long stretches of time. Skinwalker Ranch resisted the normal rules of investigation. Events didn't repeat on command. Instruments failed selectively. Cameras malfunctioned at critical moments. Witnesses described phenomena that appeared briefly, then never again. Attempts to isolate one explanation collapsed under the weight of contradictory data. For a journalist, this presented a serious problem. You can't publish patterns that won't stabilize. You can't draw conclusions from events that refuse to repeat. Knapp approached the ranch the only way he knew how, by documenting without interpretation. He focused on timelines, witness consistency, environmental conditions, and historical overlap. Instead of asking what it was, he asked what it did. That shift mattered, because while explanations varied wildly, behavior did not. Phenomena appeared to respond to attention. Activity spiked during periods of observation and declined when interest faded. Equipment failed not randomly, but situationally. Witnesses reported similar psychological effects: disorientation, anxiety, a sense of being watched, even when events differed in form. This wasn't evidence of intelligence, but it was evidence of interaction. Over time, Skinwalker Ranch became less a location and more a stress test, not of belief, but of methodology. Traditional investigative tools didn't break because the phenomena were supernatural. They broke because the environment refused to behave consistently. And consistency is the foundation of proof. Knapp resisted framing the ranch as paranormal because that language closed more doors than it opened. Instead, he treated it as an unresolved data set, one that accumulated volume without yielding clarity. That restraint frustrated audiences hungry for answers. Some wanted monsters, others wanted government experiments. Still others wanted a single, unifying theory that could explain everything. Knapp offered none, because every time a theory seemed to fit, new data arrived that didn't belong. Skinwalker Ranch taught Knapp something fundamental. Some environments don't reveal truths by accumulation. They reveal limits. Limits of measurement, limits of prediction, limits of explanation. And those limits mattered because they mirrored what he was already seeing in the broader UFO landscape. Information arriving in fragments, patterns emerging without resolution, and a persistent sense that observation itself changed outcomes. By the time Knapp stepped back from direct involvement, the ranch had become a symbol, not of mystery, but of resistance. A place where evidence existed in abundance, yet certainty remained unreachable. It wasn't answers that Skinwalker Ranch produced. It was pressure. Pressure on assumptions, pressure on methods, pressure on the idea that enough data always leads to understanding. And that pressure would soon collide with something even more complicated. The realization that some information isn't withheld because it's strange, but because of what it implies. Chapter 5. National security is not a cover story. By the time George Knapp had spent decades inside the UFO subject, one conclusion became unavoidable. Secrecy didn't exist because the topic was strange. It existed because the implications were serious. In popular culture, national security is often treated as a convenient excuse, a curtain pulled close to hide embarrassment or deception. But in real-world journalism, national security is rarely abstract. It has shape, it has incentives, and it has consequences. Many of the cases Knapp encountered weren't about extraterrestrial origins at all. They were about airspace, detection, tracking, response times, failures. If an unknown object can enter restricted military airspace without interception, that is not a UFO story. It's a vulnerability. Publishing details about how that object was detected, or how it wasn't, risks exposing systems designed to protect far more than secrecy. Knapp understood this distinction early. Some material couldn't be released not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too revealing. Radar capabilities, sensor blind spots, communication delays. The public rarely sees these as part of the UFO discussion, but to defense institutions, they are the discussion. This is where Knapp's role became most complicated. He wasn't negotiating with belief, he was negotiating with responsibility. Sources would sometimes provide information that was accurate, verifiable, and compelling. But embedded within it were details that could identify personnel, reveal procedures, or compromise operational readiness. Publishing those details wouldn't advance understanding, it would create risk. So Knapp made editorial decisions that never appeared on screen. He removed specifics, he generalized timelines, he blurred technical context. To some audiences, this looked like omission. To professionals, it looked like containment. It's important to understand what this does to a journalist over time. You begin to see how information exists in layers, the public layer, the sensitive layer, and beneath that, a layer that can never be fully exposed without consequences that extend far beyond the story itself. This layered reality explains why UFO reporting feels incomplete. Not because journalists are hiding answers, but because the full picture intersects with systems that are not designed for transparency. Knapp never framed this as a conspiracy. He framed it as infrastructure. Governments are built to absorb shock. Sudden revelations, especially ones that undermine confidence in control, are treated as destabilizing events. Information is managed not to hide truth, but to maintain continuity. That doesn't make the information false. It makes it dangerous. For Knapp, this reinforced a hard-earned lesson. Disclosure is not a switch, it's a process, and processes move slowly because they are designed to prevent collapse. Understanding this didn't make him cynical, it made him careful. He learned that the most sensitive stories weren't the ones about what the objects were, but about what institutions couldn't stop, couldn't explain, or couldn't admit publicly without consequences. And that realization reframed everything. The UFO question was no longer just about phenomena in the sky. It was about systems on the ground, systems built on control, prediction, and authority. And once you see that, you understand why some truths don't arrive as revelations. They arrive as negotiations. Chapter 6. The Weight of Knowing. By this point in his career, George Knapp had learned something most journalists never experience. It's one thing to investigate a story and reach a conclusion. It's another to live inside unresolved questions for decades. The UFO subject doesn't offer closure. It accumulates fragments, testimony without proof, data without explanation, patterns without resolution. And when you're positioned where Knapp is, those fragments don't arrive once. They arrive continuously, year after year, without ever forming a complete picture. That changes a person. Knapp has spoken about how proximity to uncertainty alters perspective. You begin to notice how often institutions speak with confidence that isn't supported by certainty. You learn how language is used to soften ignorance, to create the appearance of control where none exists. More importantly, you learn how silence functions. Silence isn't absence, it's pressure held in place. There are stories Knapp has referenced only obliquely, information that can't be shared publicly, not because it's sensational, but because releasing it would identify people who trusted him. Some sources spoke under the assumption that their words would never be broadcast. Others shared context without evidence, asking only that it be understood by someone outside their system. Carrying that kind of information creates a quiet burden. You can't confirm it publicly, you can't forget it privately, and you can't pretend it doesn't affect how you interpret everything else. Over time, Knapp learned to live with ambiguity without resolving it prematurely. That restraint isn't passive, it's active discipline. The urge to connect dots, to force coherence, to supply answers where none exist, that urge never disappears. It has to be resisted constantly. This is the cost of standing between secrecy and exposure. You become aware that certainty is rare and confidence is often performative. You see how narratives are constructed not from complete truth, but from what is tolerable to release. And you recognize how fragile public trust actually is. For Knapp, the challenge was never belief versus skepticism. It was patience. Patience with sources who might never speak again. Patience with stories that might never resolve. Patience with a subject that refuses to behave on human timelines. This long exposure to unresolved information also creates emotional distance. Not detachment, but caution. You stop reacting to single events. You stop chasing the excitement of revelation. You learn to wait for patterns that persist, not moments that spike attention. That's why Knapp rarely sounds alarmist. He has already lived with the implications. The real weight isn't knowing something extraordinary might exist. It's knowing that understanding may always arrive incomplete. And when you've carried that knowledge long enough, you stop asking when answers will come. You start asking how much uncertainty a society can tolerate, and how quickly it demands certainty even when none is available. That question sits quietly beneath everything Knapp has ever reported, and it leads to the final, unavoidable tension in his work. If silence can protect people, and disclosure can destabilize systems, what is a journalist's responsibility when neither option is clean? Chapter 7. Why he still talks. After decades of unresolved stories, withheld details, and unanswered questions, the obvious question is why George Knapp continues at all. Why not walk away? Why not retreat into silence, write a final book, and leave the uncertainty behind? The answer is simpler and harder than it sounds. Because silence has consequences too. Knapp has never believed that withholding information indefinitely serves the public. Restraint is not the same as suppression. There is a difference between protecting people and denying reality, and navigating that difference has become central to his work. Over time, Knapp's approach has evolved into something deliberate, incremental disclosure, not in the political sense, but in the journalistic one. Information is released when it can be verified, contextualized, and understood without causing unnecessary harm. Not all at once, not recklessly, but steadily. This is why Knapp continues to speak publicly. Because absence of information doesn't create stability, it creates speculation. And speculation fills gaps faster than evidence ever can. When credible journalism withdraws completely, those gaps are filled by exaggeration, ideology, and certainty without proof. Knapp understands that danger, so he keeps talking. He discusses cases that can be corroborated. He explains patterns without declaring conclusions. He acknowledges uncertainty without framing it as failure. This balance frustrates audiences on both sides. Skeptics want dismissal. Believers want confirmation. Knapp offers neither. He offers continuity, a record that persists over time, even when answers do not. There is also a deeper reason he remains engaged. Knapp has seen how institutions respond to pressure. He has watched official narratives shift slowly, sometimes imperceptibly, as decades pass. Information that was once ridiculed becomes acknowledged. Language softens, positions adjust. That movement doesn't happen because of sudden revelation. It happens because evidence accumulates and refuses to disappear. Journalists like Knapp serve as memory. They hold stories in place long enough that they can't be erased entirely, even when details are missing, even when resolution never arrives, even when public attention moves on. This is why Knapp doesn't frame his work as disclosure. He frames it as documentation. Documentation of witnesses who were once ignored. Documentation of incidents that were once denied. Documentation of a phenomenon that resists simple explanation but persists across decades. In that sense, Knapp's role isn't to reveal a final truth. It's to make sure the question itself survives intact. Because once questions disappear, so does accountability. And perhaps that is the most important function of his work. Not proving what the phenomenon is, but preventing premature closure. Preventing a story that is still unfolding from being sealed off by ridicule, fear, or convenience. Knapp continues because the alternative is worse. A world where uncertainty is replaced by certainty without evidence. A world where silence becomes the default explanation. A world where the record stops growing. And as long as credible questions remain unanswered, he believes someone has to keep asking them, carefully, responsibly, and in public. Not to end the story, but to keep it honest. After decades of reporting, interviews, documents, and unanswered questions, George Knapp occupies a strange position. He is not an insider. He is not an official spokesperson, and he is not a believer in the way the word is often used. He is something quieter, a witness to process. Knapp has seen how information moves, not cleanly, not honestly, but carefully. He's watched stories emerge slowly, not as revelations, but as adjustments. Language changes, positions soften. What was once dismissed becomes unresolved. What was once denied becomes under review. None of that happens all at once, and none of it happens without people willing to sit with uncertainty longer than is comfortable. The UFO question hasn't endured because of spectacle. It has endured because it refuses to disappear. Across decades, across administrations, across cultural shifts, the same patterns return. Sightings, encounters, data points that don't fit established explanations. What Knapp has done, more than anything else, is keep those patterns from being erased, not by shouting, not by claiming answers, but by documenting carefully and speaking when it matters. There may come a time when today's unanswered questions finally settle into clarity. Or there may not. History suggests that understanding often arrives slower than curiosity can tolerate. But journalism isn't about forcing conclusions. It's about preserving the record until conclusions are possible. If there is something truly unknown operating at the edges of our understanding, it won't be revealed by panic or certainty. It will be revealed by patience, by people willing to admit what they don't know and resist the urge to fill gaps prematurely. That's the position Knapp has held for most of his career. Not a gatekeeper of secrets, not a messenger of revelation, but a reminder that some stories are still unfolding, and that forcing an ending too soon can be just as misleading as denial. In a world that demands instant answers, George Knapp has chosen something more difficult. He has chosen to wait. And sometimes, waiting is the most honest response to the unknown.